the New York City Marathon and a former world record holder in running. Ndoma Sherpa from Nepal was once the youngest woman to ever climb Mount Everest. And Thomas Awiapo of Ghana, he holds a master's degree in public policy, and he helps people overcome poverty in his homeland, and also advocates for Catholic Relief Services, works very closely with them. Now, what do all three of these very accomplished people have in common? They all received school lunches as a child. Paul Turgot lived in Kenya, and his community was very poor, and he was hungry as a child. But he received these school lunches every day from the United Nations World Food Program. And those school lunches gave him the strength to develop into this world champion athlete. And I interviewed him and wrote a story about him on the Huffington Post. You might want to check that out. And he's just a great... One of the World Food Program representatives called him a prince of a man. That's just a great man. And he could never have accomplished what he did without those school meals. He credits those meals he received as a child for giving him the strength to grow. And a lot of his classmates became very successful as well. Now, Ndoma Sherpa, she says without the school meals, she could never have grown into the great mountain climber that she became. I mean, she scaled Mount Everest and then joined this group called the Seven Summit Women, who climb the tallest peaks in the world. These are just tremendous athletes. And she says the school meals she got from the World Food Program made all the difference. And Thomas Awiapo in Ghana, he was orphaned at age 10. And he lost two of his siblings to hunger after that happened. And he says that he would go to the school that Catholic Relief Services set up, and he would smell the food, so he would wander over to the school, and he would get a lunch there. And then he would, well, since he got that, he would go into school, and he said once he got the meal, he'd try to figure out how to escape the school. He didn't want to, he felt, he wasn't interested in school, but because there was a meal there, he kept going. And they said they tricked him. Catholic Relief Services tricked him into going to school. But eventually he learned to love school, and then we see the result today. He has a master's degree. He's this great advocate. You could look him up on YouTube, for example, and you'll see videos of him. And he's this great. In fact, I interviewed him last year, and right before I interviewed him, he had spoken to Congress advocating for the program that we are going to advocate for here today. That's the McGovern-Dole Global School Lunch Program. And Thomas says that act of kindness, that simple meal, gave him a life. And think about all the children in the world who can get this chance just through this simple meal. I wrote a book, actually, I interviewed a lot of representatives from the World Food Program about these school lunch programs. I'm going to pass this around. There we go. Oops. And I'm also going to pass around this article I wrote in the Easter Day Cincinnati Enquirer. Just some background. And also this letter I wrote in the Washington Post where I talk about this school lunch program. So the McGovern-Dole Global School Lunch Program provides funding to Catholic Relief Services, the World Food Program, and other charities so they can provide school meals in developing countries. And in many of these countries, the children, it's a struggle for them to get one meal a day. And that's why in these poor countries, if they don't get the meal, the parents will not send their kids to school in the first place. They might keep them home to work. They'll never get an education. They'll never be able to grow and advance. So the meals are an incentive for the parents to send their kids to school. And with that, in some cases, if the children do not have these meals, they will end up, begging in the streets and all these terrible situations that the children should not be in. So the meals can really rescue them from a terrible fate by allowing them to go to school and sort of give them a pathway out of poverty, like they did for Thomas Awiapo. So now I think I'd like to show you a video. How do I start that up? Yeah, I'm going to show you a short video I made to give you a visual about the school lunch program, some of the history behind it.
World War II was the most destructive conflict in human history. With the horrific fighting came unimaginable human suffering and chaos. And when the war ended in 1945, there was not peace. The enemy of hunger was still on the attack. Food was desperately needed by millions of people in Europe and Asia. Children were the most in need.
The children of today are forming each day the mental concepts, the mental prejudices, the emotions that are going to rule and govern them through their lifetime. And over at least half of the earth, they are hungry. In many instances, in many countries, almost universally, they are going in packs, up and down alleys. They are searching for a garbage heap in which they find all too little of any kind of sustenance that will keep them alive. Every man here who served with me in Europe has witnessed this with his own eyes. How can we expect children who are reduced almost to an animal-like a level of existence, struggling each day, how can we expect them to develop the ideas and the ideals that in the future will bring them to be apostles of peace? They are, by very nature of the struggle they are carrying on, wedded to the philosophy of force. Whatever they get by their own efforts and by scratching in the garbage heap. That cannot go on if we are to have peace.
Help was on the way from the United States and its allies. In Austria, United States General Mark Clark and his staff urgently sought to stop the rising malnutrition among Austrian children. To fight child hunger in Austria, school lunch programs were started. Who would think that something as simple as soup and a roll could be a life-changing event for a child? But with that extra meal, children could gain much-needed nourishment and be able to concentrate better in school. The United States and its allies sought to expand the school lunch program in Austria. In Germany, former President Herbert Hoover found children in a desperate condition from hunger and malnutrition. Hoover started a school lunch program for millions of German kids. United States General Lucius Clay wrote that this school feeding program saved the health of German youth and did more to convince the German people of our desire to recreate their nation than any other action on our part. There is still a tremendous need for school lunch programs. Food and education are what children and these developing nations need to have a future. The United States supports school lunch programs in impoverished nations through the McGovern-Dole Food for Education program. It is named after former Senators Bob Dole and George McGovern. The program is carried out by charities like Catholic Relief Services, World Vision, CARE, the World Food Program.
Increase the funding for the program. I mean, the funding is about, as I wrote in the Washington Post, the funding was about $200 million a year. That's a very tiny percentage of the federal budget. We probably spend oh gosh, well over $20 billion at least a year on nuclear weapons. So, I mean, the food aid funding is very relatively tiny part of the federal budget. And so to increase that funding, we could feed so many more children. So many Catholic Relief Services, World Food Program, they could reach so many more kids with these meals. You can see what a difference they make. And I found it really interesting on that video from Eisenhower, who was a big advocate for feeding the hungry. In fact, when he became president, that's when the Food for Peace program started, our great, which I read about there in the Post. The Food for Peace program started and school meals, and George McGovern later became the director of that program. But maybe that'd be something you could talk about with some of your relatives that maybe were in the war, that they might have seen, like I've talked to my father, he has witnessed the scenes of hunger over there after the war, and so did George McGovern and Bob Dole, and that's one of the reasons why they started those feeding programs, because they were very moved by what they saw, and they realized that these societies could not recover from the war without help, especially the children who suffer the most in these conflicts or disasters, that they need the help, and the school lunches is one of the great ways and simple ways to help them. So what you can do is you could be an advocate for the school lunch program just by writing to your representative in Congress. In fact, I know Chris has got an email form and also a handout that she's going to distribute to you, where you can send an email to Congressman Steve Shabbat, Senator Rob Portman, Senator Sherrod Brown. Congress decides the funding for these programs. They're the ultimate decision maker on that. So what they hear from the public will influence their decisions in budget negotiations, because they get together, with the representatives, and they make these decisions. And so it's critical that they get the input from the public. How many of you have ever written to Congress before? Okay, so you're experienced because of that. Okay, and this will be a first time good experience to first time, and you can indicate on there when you contact them that if you want a response or not. I would say yes, go for a response, and see what it is, And how many of you have ever written a letter to the editor? Oh yeah? Did it get published?
No.
Oh! I don't like it when that happens.
I know.
That's frustrating. Well, that can happen sometimes, but that'd be another good exercise you could do, is write a letter to the editor and talk about these programs, and talk about something. How many of you are in nursing, studying nursing, nutrition, or education? So you know the importance of meals for children and nutrition for children that they're going to learn.
Yeah.
So you know that would be a good personal angle that you could use. And I hear that from teachers when I speak to some of the classes here. They'll tell me about that. And
the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Exactly. So you've got a personal angle there, and just any experience you've had, like how many of you are involved with like athletics? Oh, so okay. Half in, half out.
Yeah.
Okay. Close to retirement.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, you can keep going with the charity miles for good. I am retired after that came out. But that would be another angle, because look at Paul Turgot. An athlete could never reach your potential as an athlete unless you have nutrition. There's just no way. I mean, and Paul Turgot could never have become this world record holder, marathon champ, without that help he got from the World Food Program. That's why he's such a big advocate for them. When I interviewed him, he had just gotten done also speaking in Congress, or speaking to people in Washington, the decision makers. So he's an ambassador actually for the World Food Program. So you have just your own personal angles, and think of what you want children in your community to receive. We have a national school lunch program here for our country. We think it's important. It's also important for other countries, and there are ways that we can help them. every country should have a national school lunch program. I mean, that's good for the development of every country. It's good for the stability of every country. And we can help provide that through this program, through the McGovern-Dole program. So, oh yeah, Carissa's going to send out...
I just emailed all of you basically what is in front of you right now.
Yes.
So in case you want to copy and paste anything
Right.
that is under the sample text, you can do that instead of retyping it. So.
I included some talking points. In fact, I interviewed, there's one down below from Catholic Relief Services, one of the representatives in Mali, that she talks about the importance of the program there. That's a country that suffered from conflict and drought too. And Catholic Relief Services provides meals in there. How many of you're familiar with Haiti, right? The earthquake that happened there some years back. One of the most important programs when they were doing the reconstruction was the school lunch program for Haiti, and the McGovern-Dole is a supporter of that program. Through McGovern-Dole funding through the World Food Program. So you can see how important these initiatives are for helping societies recover from devastation, whether it's an earthquake or a drought or especially conflict. You saw that graphic in the video. I pulled that quote about the 45 countries needing assistance. That was from the U.S. Famine Warning System report they did. Because of all the countries that are at risk right now in the world, there are actually 4 countries, you may have heard of this, at risk of famine right now. That would be South Sudan, Yemen, Nigeria, and Somalia. And there's a number of countries that are suffering major food shortages from either conflict or drought. Like, you're all familiar with Syria, right? You heard in the news recently. Well, that's a country that is really suffering from food shortages because of the war, which anytime there's these wars, it destroys agriculture. Something that, we might take for granted in this country, a functioning food production and market system where food can be grown, food can be moved. All those things sort of disappear, especially when there's conflict. And when there's drought, the farmers can't produce food. And think of what this does to the families that are living in these areas, that they can't, if they can't grow crops, they can't feed their family, then it creates a domino effect of terrible things. They don't have the resources, maybe they can't send their children to school, so they keep them home to work so the children don't get education, or they might have to sell off their assets. But in cases where these crisis situations, that if the World Food Program or Catholic Relief Services comes in and says, we're going to provide food here for your child, they'll send their children to school. It's a big relief, for one thing, a big safety net, and they'll send their kid to school. They don't have to lose out on their education. And there's many cases of children not being able to finish education. That's something obviously all of you have achieved very far, and could be further soon once you graduate, have advanced very far along the educational ladder. And that's something that a lot of these countries, the children just don't have a chance. They don't even get out of grade school, or they don't advance very far at all. And so the school lunch programs sort of give those children a chance to go to school. Like Thomas Awiapo, if he hadn't had that meal from Catholic Relief Services, what would have happened to him? So, and we might never have heard of him. Or Paul Turgat. Who knows? Would we ever have heard of him? So, I think it shows you the importance of these meals, and also how simple it is. It's relatively simple. It's not some rocket science equation that we have to figure out. I mean, this is just the basics. And if we can help these countries build basically the ultimate goal, you want to build the country into a national school lunch program so that each have one. So these programs can help them, especially through McGovern-Dole funding, and give these children nutrition that they need to grow, and this is really a great program to advocate for, and it doesn't get a lot of attention. So a lot of people aren't really aware of it. I mean, how many of you have heard of the McGovern-Dole school lunch program before today, for example? Probably, yeah. It doesn't get a lot of, it's really not in the news that much. And I think a lot of times, like when we see these countries in the news, whether it's Syria or Afghanistan, and we've seen them in the news a lot over the years, obviously, but we don't really see what the effects of these conflicts or different situations have on those families and those children. You don't really always see that. It's sort of a quiet crisis that happens in the homes and in the communities. And like Herbert Hoover was saying, that famine is the inevitable aftermath of war. And think of a World War II, our experience in the war, that what happened after World War II. And maybe this isn't taught that much in school, but there was the famine that was going to engulf Europe after the war. And think if we had not come to the rescue then, and you saw some of that in the video. Some of the clips from that video were from a film called Seeds of Destiny, which the Eisenhower authorized a filmmaker to go around Europe and film these scenes, and they brought them back to the States to show people the suffering in Europe after the war. And a lot of people didn't want to show it because it was hard to watch, you know. So they had to go underground and show it to people, and it actually ended up winning an Academy Award for its showing the scenes of devastation overseas. And Mount St. Joe, for example, I did a story on this actually called "Small College Captures the Spirit of the Marshall Plan." You can look that up on Huffington Post. Mount St. Joe was one of the schools that was a leader after the war with fundraisers, helping Catholic Relief Services, actually. Because Catholic Relief Services, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, actually got to start during the war, and Mount St. Joe was one of the schools that helped them with food collections. The Mount St. Joe did a lot to, and the whole community. In Cincinnati, there were, you saw that speech that Hoover was making on the video. Well, after that speech, a couple days after, a man in Cincinnati walked into one of the collection centers and donated his entire paycheck to the relief effort. So that just shows you how moved people were about these scenes, and how really the greatest generation, that's just what the article I just wrote in the Inquirer was about, that actually really rose to the occasion. And food is peace, you know, food for peace. That's why Eisenhower started that initiative. And I think these school lunches really, do that justice, food for peace. So what you guys can do is you can contact your reps and sort of encourage them to give enough funding for the program so they can reach more kids, and sort of make your voice known in these budget negotiations. What you basically do is, there's a link, and I put this to each representative. Now, all of you are Ohio residents, or that's what I assumed. So you would, you contact the rep, and they have a form you fill out. You fill out your information, and they'll have like a box where you write the letter, and you basically, you keep it short and sweet and to the point. You just basically tell them, that you support the McGovern-Dole school lunch program, and that you would like to see its funding level. I have a quote there, $300 million a year or higher. I'd like it to be higher if it could be, but at least that. And you tell them, maybe throw in your personal connection to the issue. Maybe you took part in a fundraiser. How many of you have done charity miles here at Mount St. Joe? Oh, you have?
What is it?
Oh,
Did you say charity?
Charity Miles. It's an app where runners and walkers use it at Mount St. Joe.
I think I was going to do that.
Oh, you were going to do it?
Yeah, I was.
Well, close enough. you were getting there, but it's an app that the athletes would use at the school, or just anyone who runs and walks. We had a couple of students get over 2,000 miles, actually.
Oh my goodness.
That's a lot. But I've done over 4,000. So they come out of retirement. former runner for elder. So, that'll be one connection. Or if you've taken part in any of the fundraisers here, how many of you did free rice here at the Mount St. Joe? The free rice game, maybe in school.
I've done that before.
You have?
Yeah,
You
I
have?
love it.
Oh.
I studied anatomy doing it.
Where's the
Oh, that's a good idea. If you should
Yeah.
study any of those subjects are good to study with. Free rice. Actually, wrote 17 questions for that game, by the way. It's in the World Hunger section. I was going to do a history section, but I didn't get it done. The person left who was in charge. But the free rice, that would be a good one because that benefits the school meals. Actually, the
I
free
didn't know
rice.
if I actually did it with that. It was just like answering questions.
Oh, no, you raised money for the World Food Program to provide the school lunches. You would have done it. That would be like a personal connection. Good job. See, that shows you. I mean, free rice is a great game. You could mention that you have done this effort with free rice before, and you have supported school lunches, and that's one way you do it. So that's good.
Where does it currently stand in terms of the budget debate? You know?
Okay, what happened was that the president put out his budget. He does that every year. The president will submit a budget. The McGovern-Dole was given 0 funding in the last 2 budgets. However, the Congress has, through outrage and things like that, has kept the program at the funding level that it has been at before. But we're not increasing the funding level. And my argument is that, like we did after World War II when the hunger crisis was increased, that we need to rise to the occasion when there's a great challenge. I mean, when you're faced with a great challenge, you step up your game. You step up your effort. And I think that that's what we have to do, especially when you see the 45 countries. This is like the worst hunger crisis since World War II. That's what the experts are calling it. Because you have more displaced people than any time since then. You have the 4 countries threatened with famine. You have drought in a lot of countries. So you have a severe hunger crisis going on that you really don't hear a lot about in the news. But some of it you hear about. I mean, when you see like those wars in Syria, there's a great hunger crisis, a massive one ongoing in the Middle East. And just when you see the news clips of that Syria situation, just think of all the people displaced and hungry because of that. And not just within Syria, but many have fled to other countries in the Middle East or onto Europe. Some are trying to, they want to get. Some are trying to settle in the United States, actually. But so the budget really, when they're forming the budget, they need to hear from you. I mean, you guys are the ones. It's like Lincoln said, government by the people. So you guys have to make your voices heard in the budget negotiations. Tell the representatives work for you. I mean, you're not working for them. You're the ones that are in charge.
I think you make a great point, Phil, when the impulse to alleviate hunger, comes from a place of compassion and
Yes.
justice, but also, I mean, the connection between hunger and world stability and peace.
Oh, yeah.
It's so,
Absolutely.
huge. And so it's so short-sighted
Yes.
to, put a lot of money into military spending and that sort of thing.
Right.
When, it creates so much, regional instability and ultimately international instability.
Right.
And people who are hungry, starving, are much more vulnerable to demagogues and
Terrorist recruitment, for one.
Terrorist
They said that's one of the big worries.
Right.
They're
So
desperate. You're desperate.
They're desperate,
You're
and
desperate.
so if somebody comes and says, "Oh, I will solve your problems for you,"
Well, you may have no choice.
Right.
So, and what Eisenhower said, that you could spend too much on military spending. So he said, God help this country when someone sits in this office that doesn't know as much about the military as I do. And I think for that reason that that if you spend too much on the military, you actually hurt your security. You hurt your security. So you have to be very careful there when you're spending on that. So you have to watch that, and you have to not ignore the other instruments of peace. Food for peace, for one. And I think that we can see that from, this is 70th anniversary today, or we just had the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. How many of you heard of the Marshall Plan? We have. Excellent. Okay, good. I'm happy with that. I think you've discussed that in some of the classes. That's George Marshall's plan for the rebuilding Europe. Food was as Marshall himself said, food is the very basis of all reconstruction, and that the United States food was the first. In fact, right before the Marshall Plan even took effect or was passed by Congress, and this is probably a lesser known program, obviously, there was a food aid bill, which I call like the pre-Marshall Plan, which was to sustain some of the countries through that winter, so that, because Marshall testified before Congress and said, well, if they don't get this food, then no recovery program is going to work because the people will be all starving. So they had a big food aid program. In fact, how many of you have heard of the Friendship Train? The Friendship Train. Okay, well, the Friendship Train was also 70 years ago last year, 1947, that's when the first one ran, and that train went coast to coast picking up food, and it stopped in Cincinnati, was one of the stops, and it started in California and went all across the country picking up food, and they sent it overseas and fed the hungry in Europe, that in response to the hunger emergency that President Truman had told the nation about. And what that Friendship Train, one of the men who started it was saying how it gave people a sense of control over foreign policy of the country. Instead of just sitting back and watching, like we sort of do when you turn on the TV and you just watch what they're going to do, you sort of feel like a spectator. You have no power, you feel like sometimes. Well, the Friendship Train gave people the power to say, well, we're going to feed the hungry, we're going to take action, and they could do that through the Friendship Train. So it gave people this real sense of power, and it gave an example to Congress to help them pass the Marshall Plan as well, because they saw what the citizenry was doing. So when you do things like Play Free Rice, do fundraisers on campus, it's really good to spread the word about them. So, and I do that when I write articles. I've written a lot of articles, of course, about different events that have happened here. The people see that, and there's an example. It sets an example for them, and then the people in Congress see that. So that's another powerful way to sort of get the message out. And then, obviously, when you write a letter, you can tell them about that. I played Free Rice, and we had this, tournament or something like that. That's a good idea, Free Rice tournaments. Ithaca College does that. They have like Free Rice nights, and they all gather and play. Or the charity miles, like one of the things I encourage the teams to do here was to have when the athletes are doing their training, is to run and walk and tabulate those miles, because each mile is a meal, school meal. So, and they could, different events like that. So, or like a letter writing campaign. And then when people hear about that, that all helps to raise awareness, and then people are taking action.